The first one is from Jin Young in Korea. Jin Young in Korea. And the question is, how do I get a relationship of respect with my boss? This is an interesting question because we talked about the second point is confronting God. But the key point was what? Is clearly understanding the relationship. Okay? Now, it really depends on how important or how major this relationship is to you with your boss. Because sometimes it's not worth it to set parameters and boundaries. Why? Because sometimes people are not that good. The first relationships that you really, really have to start gaining or like making the respect boundaries is with the people closest to you, like family and friends. Those are the most important. They're most important. And then from after that, if you can make one with your boss, it's great too. However, one of the things if it's worth the risk for you, because there's some bosses that are really terrible, but if it's worth it for you to pick this fight, if it's worth it, then you don't want to enable anyone. Enabling someone means that someone puts you down and you allow it to happen, which means you enable them to do it more. So if someone makes fun of me and really puts me down in front of everyone, and I just sit there like this and don't do anything, I'm enabling them to continue to do it. You know what I mean? Which means that you should, if it was me, I would speak up, but not in front of everyone. But I would go privately to my boss and say, hey, boss, the joke you made was pretty funny at my expense, but it was a little bit hurtful. And I would like it in the future if you didn't like pick on me this much, you know. And then you would respectfully speak to him. Why? Even though Abraham had a clear understanding of his relationship with God, he still knew who God was. So whenever he talked to God, he's like, God, please don't be upset. Please don't be angry. But can I ask one more? It's like, what if it's 10? Which means he clearly understood the relationship and that God is in a higher position. Which means that don't expect to have a same relationship with your boss, because it's not the same relationship. He is, in a hierarchy, he is above you. So you need to understand the relationship from that perspective. And sometimes it's worth it, and sometimes it's not. All right? Thank you, Jin Young from Korea. Let's look at next question. Let's take a look at John in Kuala Lumpur. Oh, no, Tim. It's good, Tim. Tim in New Zealand says, you talked about Abraham sacrificing his son for something bigger. How do I know what to sacrifice? Okay, so that's a great question because you might be thinking to yourself is, how do I know something's bigger than what I have right now? Now, some things are very obvious. Like I told you, if there's like a million, like, you know, either your son dies or a million people die, and that becomes a little bit more obvious. Even though it hurts a lot, it's a little bit more obvious. But there are some things that are not as obvious, right? And this is why what I suggest to a lot of people is you should write down priorities. Like priorities. Yeah. You have to constantly remind yourself what is more important than the other. And that's something I do suggest as advice for the things that are like very clear, obviously. Like for instance, it is your wife over everyone else, obviously. Your husband over everyone else. Your children over everyone else. Even your own parents, obviously, right? But after that, it gets a little bit more blurred. Okay, so I want you should write down your priorities too of what is more important to you. Okay, let's go to John in Kuala Lumpur. Great question here too. Is there a link between God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son and God sacrificing his only son, Jesus? And of course there's a link. And the big link there is both of them were for like a large group of people. For Abraham, he was sacrificing, he was basically showing God his faith. Because when you're starting something, you have to start properly, and faith was the most important part. But if you have someone who doesn't really have absolute faith in God, and they're not even willing to give away the most precious thing, then how could God use that person? If they're not even willing to give up what's most sacred to them, when God should be more sacred, right? The same way too, both histories, right? Both at the time of Jesus, he sacrificed for the world, and Abraham too was basically sacrificing for Israel, which would turn into, like at that time was the world. In the Old Testament time, it was the chosen people. So there is a direct link. And the one thing I find very like awesome about this story is God wouldn't tell people to do what he wouldn't do himself. And he actually did it. He actually sacrificed his only son. So it's not like he was asking people to do something just out of whim, like, you know what? Let's just see how faithful he is. Let's make him sacrifice his son. No. Even God was willing to do it himself. He would never ask people to do something that he wouldn't do himself. Okay, let's go to the next one. We're going to Hong in Johor. Hong in Johor says, I know God has a bigger picture for me, but how do I gain the faith to really believe and entrust myself to Him? Great question. Now, what did Abraham do that made it so easy for him to believe? It's actually faith. That's the thing that he did more than anything else. The faith was the biggest thing, which means that, I'm assuming you're someone of faith, which means if you really believe that God is great, God knows all things, God is almighty and all-powerful, and like you said, He has a bigger picture for you, then your faith is seen by what you do and not just by what you believe, right? So when I tell a lot of people this, is like, if you have two cliffs like this and there's an invisible bridge, let's say there's an invisible bridge. If you really believed, if you really had faith there's an invisible bridge, what would you actually do? And the answer is, you would actually cross it. That's why in James chapter 2, verse 26 is like, faith without deeds is dead, right? Faith without deeds, right? You have to be someone, when it comes to true faith, you may not know what's going to happen. You may not know what, if something's going to happen in the right way. Like, you don't know what the actual result is going to be, but you need to have faith that because God has a bigger, He's got something bigger in mind for you, that He's leading you the right way. And it requires you to have faith, right? So for us, when it, let me tell you something interesting about faith too is, whether you believe in God or not, faith is one of the most essential things in this world. Why do you need faith? You need faith because you don't have full information, right? Well, let me ask you this question. How much faith do you have? Like, how much do you know 100% what your major is going to be in university? How much do you know 100% what your job's going to be after that? How much do you know 100% the person you're going to marry? Honestly, it takes faith in everything because you're not 100%. You're never 100% in anything in this world. Faith is required for everything in life. And that's why when you kind of say, hey, God, show me God, prove to me 100% God is there, and then I'll believe, you can't say that. Why? Because almost everything that's in your life begins with faith because you don't have full information. And that's why things start with you having faith, not knowing for sure what's going to be at the end, but trusting that God is going to lead you to a better place. So you got to do first. As crazy as that sounds, you got to do first. Okay, let's go to last question. So last question from Joanna in PJ. This is also in PJ's in Malaysia too. And the question is there a difference between having faith and being obedient to God? And the answer is, they're kind of connected to each other, right? They're kind of connected to each other. Why? Because having faith, if you have faith, you will be obedient. If you have faith, you will be obedient. So they are interconnected. Because you can't be obedient unless you have faith in this person. Of course, unless it's, in these days, you don't have any like masters who are beating you if you're a slave or whatever not, right? But you have to realize that in these days, you go in, it's a transactional, two people are willing to, one is willing to hire, one is willing to work. And because you have some trust in this boss, you're going to be obedient to them. Same thing with God, right? Everything we have to understand is when it comes to obedience, you have to have faith in them first to be obedient. Because if you have if you have a really crappy government, like say something happening in countries like say communist countries, then there's no trust. So when they tell you to do something, they're not very obedient. And they'll be obedient for a bit, but you need faith before obedience comes in, right? Unless you're getting beaten to death, right? Or they're threatening you with your like killing your family or whatever it is. But there's none of these cases really right now. So yeah, you need faith before having obedience. Okay. We have one more question. Perfect. One more question. This is the last question today from Yanlan Lo. And this is from Facebook. We're not sure where they're from. How can we know how much faith we have gained? Right? How can we know how much faith we have gained? That's interesting. Because let's take a look at this for a second. Is faith is not something that has a metric. Like love. Love has no metric. Like there's no such thing as hey, I gave you 72% love, but you only give me 61%. We don't have a metric for it. We don't really. In the end, the only metric we have is not so much what I think in my head, but is also what I do for the person, right? When it comes to my faith, you can't really tell by inside your head. And you know why? Let me give you an example of when it comes to love, because the Bible is about love, right? What is the metric of love? Well, the metric of love, you will understand the metric of love if someone keeps saying to you, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you, but they're with someone else every other day. And then they say, I'm sorry, and then they're with another girl. Then they say, no, I'm sorry, and they go with another girl. And then they say something like, how much do you think they love you? Even though they say it with their heart, no, I really love you, I'm so sorry, I just can't control myself. Well, if you really love me, you could control yourself, right? Faith is very similar too. Because the last question, it kind of ties with the last question is, faith has to do with obedience also. Because I have faith in this person, or faith, like say we have faith in God, then what about the obedience? Then obedience becomes one of the metrics we have. It's not the whole thing. Why? Because it's not just what you do, it's also what's inside your heart at the same time. And this is why it's very hard for someone else on the outside to judge. The only person who can really understand is you yourself. But part of it has to do with, I think one advice I will give you right now is, try not to think about how much you've gained, but you just have to think about is how much you're growing. And that's a way better way to look at it. Because it's really hard to say you've gained, 10 points in faith? How would you know what 10 points is? And what would it go up to? Right? The best thing you can look at when it comes to the metric of faith is, am I doing better than before? Is my faith better? Am I, say, more obedient? Do I pray more? You know, do I feel God more? Right? You have to look at both things that are action-oriented and things that are also like emotionally or heart-centered. And you have to check both of those things out and see if you're growing bigger or growing in your faith. Okay? So yeah, I couldn't give you a real metric, but more than the metric itself is, I believe a better metric is, are you growing in your faith or not? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Yanlan Lo from Facebook. Thank you so much for that question. That brings us to the end of today's Lockdown Tuesday. I hope you guys had a wonderful, wonderful time, and I had a wonderful time here, just staring into a camera, hoping that there's people on the other side. But we'll see you next week again at 8 p.m. here on Facebook. And for those of you who want to see this again, it'll also be on the YouTube channel Espresso with Sky. All right, everyone, see you later. Take care and have a good day or good night. Bye-bye. Hey guys, thanks for watching. This is Sky. Make sure you click subscribe, obliterate that like button, leave some comments, and support us on Patreon. All right, catch you later.